Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thanks to our guests, Mr. Sinclair and Dr. Kury. So one of the issues that comes up a lot when we talk about the COVID pandemic, and especially when we're talking in areas that tend to be prone to disasters, is how do you prepare for disasters? How do you manage disasters when this whole pandemic thing is still in the air, if you will? And we have two very good speakers to talk with us about that today. One of those is Mr. Sinclair. He is the CEO of the Bahamas Telecommunications Company Limited. He's also vice president of the Northern Cluster of Cable and Wireless Communications that includes the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Cayman. He's previously president of the Caribbean Cable and Wireless Communications, managing director of FLOW Jamaica, and president and COO of Dehring, Bunting, and Golding Limited. So a lot of great experience managing difficult situations in telecommunications. Dr. Ted Kury is PERC's Director of Energy Studies. He's advised to numerous governments around the world in the United States on hurricane preparedness and has led Florida's cooperative research on hurricanes and electric infrastructure. He wrote and manages Florida's computer programs for predicting and analyzing electric grid resilience, has published research in this and related issues, and he's a sought-after teacher on utility regulation worldwide. So, gentlemen, thank you for being here. So let's just jump right into it. Let me start with you, Garfield. So could you please describe what the Bahamas experiences were in 2019 with hurricanes and the lessons that were learned along the way?
Wow, thank you again for having me, Mark. Really appreciate the opportunity. Look, 2019 was what we refer to in the Bahamas as a bit of a black swan event. I mean, we were hit by Hurricane Dorian, which frankly just defied all of the sort of planning and preparation and just our scope of how catastrophic a weather event could be. We had up to 220 mile per hour wind gusts. The hurricane sat on top of Grand Bahama for 40 hours straight. You know, you're used to hurricanes sort of moving slowly, but moving, and keeping moving. It just sat on top of Grand Bahama for like 40 hours. So the devastation was catastrophic. Our towers, our poles for mobility services just couldn't withstand. We built poles traditionally to withstand 150 mile an hour wind gusts, which we thought we'd never get to. Well, we got to 220. So Black Swan event was super tough to prepare. But I think one of the main lessons learned, because we're used to hurricane and catastrophic weather events, frankly. Obviously, they're getting bigger and bigger and more debilitating, but we're used to preparing and getting through them. I think the one lesson that keeps sort of reiterating itself is that, focus on your people. What we did was we focused almost single-mindedly on making sure that everybody was okay. And we literally threw all hands on deck to ensure not only that we found every one of our colleagues, because these were debilitating times, particularly in places like Abaco, where, people, the percentage of the population that sort of lost housing and the ability to just move around and mobility was huge. So we focused first and foremost on making sure that we managed to locate all of our people, take good care of our people, get as soon as we could, went into Abaco, went into Grand Bahama, got people out of there, because it's not just the smartest move and the best move from a humane standpoint. It's also smart commercially, because these are the people that are going to get you back on your feet as a business and help you commercially as well and help you restore, right? So they've got to be taken care of. They've got to be given a sense of normality again. They've got to feel like the company cares about them. And that's what gets them the impetus and the fight to sort of get back up on their feet and help to restore infrastructure so you can get your customers back up and running again. So I'd say in a nutshell, that would sum up sort of our approach to catastrophic events, period.
All right, well, that's fascinating. Zeroing in on the human aspects. And nothing happens without humans, and it's all for the humans to begin with. So that's really, really interesting. Ted, the pivotal point for Florida in thinking about hurricanes and utility infrastructure was the 2004-2005 hurricane season. Describe to us how things changed after that, and some of the work that you were involved in and how it works.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, 2004, 2005 really was kind of a couple of watershed seasons for Florida. I mean, the state was hit by 10 hurricanes over the course of 2 hurricane seasons. And following the 2005 hurricane season, the Florida Public Service Commission started saying, look, we need to be talking more about what are the types of things we could be doing to make the electricity grid in Florida more resilient. And so they brought in the utilities, they brought in interested stakeholders, consumer groups, basically, everybody who's a stakeholder within Florida for a series of workshops. And they learned that the utilities had been working on these things. I mean, the utilities had been asking these same questions. What they may not have been doing as well as maybe the regulator would have liked was sharing what they know. So one of the big initiatives that came out of that series of meetings following the 2005 hurricane season was a commitment to get everybody, every year before each hurricane season, all the utilities, they go up to Tallahassee. The meeting is broadcast on the internet for anybody who's interested in taking a look. And the utilities talk about, these are the types of things that we've done to prepare our system for these events. This is how those initiatives have performed. And this is what we're planning on doing this year. So if there's something that, Florida Power and Light could learn from Orlando Utilities Commission, or JEA could learn from Duke, or Tallahassee could learn from Tampa Electric. Everybody has the opportunity to do that. And there's a much greater understanding and cooperation among the utilities tackling this problem collectively rather than on an individual basis, which was the general form before that hurricane season. So it wasn't that the utilities weren't thinking about the problem. They were. But what they hadn't yet harnessed was the collective effort, the ability to share what they were learning. And that, I think, was the main thing that came out of that hurricane season. There's a lot more sharing, a lot more transparency. And as you mentioned, PERC has been fortunate enough to be the designated academic partner and involved in coordinating these efforts. And so I've been, lucky enough to work with this great group of folks, over the last 10 years.
Okay, well, we'll get to more details on that later. I remember the first meeting we had with the utilities after those 2 seasons, and they all got up and put up their PowerPoint slides of all the different damages they'd had, and they had not seen those from each other before. And we had consultants and scholars and regulators in the room, and everybody just listed what are the things we don't know that we should know. And then we took that and developed an action plan. How are we going to learn these things? So it's some really good leadership by the regulator in making all that happen. Garfield, let me come back to you. So as you step into the 2020 season, how do you take the things you've learned and kind of the new aspirations you've set? How's that changed your approach, and what are the things you're doing now that you really hadn't done before?
Yeah, no, sure, Mark. Look, the COVID-19 pandemics, again, been another, to use the doctor's words, another watershed event, right? Again, unprecedented. Nobody sort of had to sort of administer businesses and their lives through something like this. So it's focused us quite a bit, but we've not lost the primary focus, which is on people, right? So the advent of COVID-19, we took the same approach. The first thing was health and safety. Got to make people feel safe, have to make sure that we adhere to all of the key protocols to ensure that we reduced and in fact eliminated hopefully the exposure of any of our colleagues, our 700 plus colleagues to this virus, right? So knock on wood, to date, we can say not a single colleague's actually contracted the virus. But it's meant that 90%, given all of the lockdowns and the various orders that governments have had to issue throughout the region in order to control this pandemic, we've been subjected to having to work from home. So 90% of staff are working from home. So we've had to prepare for hurricane season remotely, largely. I think that's made us more resilient. I think it's created a more resilient scenario planning process, so that we've had to focus our scenario planning now on remote scenario planning. The interjections during the scenarios have been a lot more, let's just say, dramatic, in order to really test our ability to administer and get through a hurricane, dealing with it remotely like we have to do. But again, the North Star is focusing on people. We've made clear that infrastructure, it'll break, it'll get seawater in it, whatever will happen to it, we can fix it, we can replace that. Can't replace people. So our primary focus, and in catastrophic events like this, you really need a bit of a North Star. You can't sort of be going down rabbit holes. We've said, look, we're going to focus on people, taking care of people, making sure that they're safe. And once we do that, then we can focus on sort of the damage assessments and getting infrastructure back up and running again. I mean, there's some key learnings coming out of the last hurricane that is going to enable us to focus quite a bit on the infrastructure. We've got to bury more of our backhaul fiber, for instance. The aerial approach to running fiber clearly is not resilient enough. And so we're going to have to bury a lot of that cable, to John Reed's question, which I know is coming. So we're going to focus on burying cable quite a bit. We're clearly going to have to make towers more resilient. We're going to have to infrastructure share more, frankly. It's going to force us to cooperate with our competitors more, which is a good thing. And then you just compete on service, right? But the infrastructure, pretty much we're using the same stuff. In order to be more resilient, we got to share more, I think. So those are the kinds of things that we're focused on.
All right, so I have a question for Ted, but I want to ask a follow-up on what you just said. Because I can imagine that you have employees who kind of sometimes get a sense of hubris or bravado, and they want to just charge in and fix things and take risks. How do you as the leader help them not take those inappropriate risks?
Well, by telling them, right? By making it quite clear on all those sat phone calls, right? So remember, when you're in the middle of these things, you're not communicating like you normally do. Somebody's got a sat phone, you get them on that sat phone, and you say, look, take care of the family. What do you need? Do not go out there and be heroic, please. Now, sometimes it doesn't work. These guys in Abaco, I can remember vividly from Abaco through Dorian, we had some superhuman efforts by technicians, guys whose whole lives are about taking care of customers, getting customers back up and running, getting outside plant fixed when it's not. This is their lives. They can't sit back and watch that infrastructure just go, by the wayside. They've got to get out there. So despite you imploring them, they continue to get out there and take risks, and you've just got to pray, right? Because even after telling them, look, focus on family and being safe, the adrenaline just gets going, like you said.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that. Ted, Garfield mentioned hardening the infrastructure, making sure that they were changing practices that kind of meet some of the new risks, or at least the new economics of risks. PERC was involved in some of that work here for Florida. Could you describe some of the things that you've done and how some of the tools you've developed are being used?
Sure. Some of the, one of the things that we basically we've had three distinct focuses of the efforts. One was a focus on data gathering, and so the utility partners in the cooperative, they entered into an agreement with a private firm, WeatherFlow, where basically they allowed WeatherFlow to install wind monitoring equipment, high granularity wind monitoring equipment within their property, and in return, WeatherFlow then shares the data with the utilities. So the utilities get data that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. Well, for that matter, everybody gets access to data that wouldn't be available otherwise. And WeatherFlow got access to areas that they normally wouldn't have access to. So, it was an interesting partnership. We studied quite extensively vegetation management practices. And, what are the types of things, are there different ways that you can trim trees, for example? We've got a lab here at the University of Florida run by an engineering professor, Forrest Masters. And Forrest does a lot of work on the effect of wind on vegetation and weather on homes. And, in the vegetation management, the techniques that we discussed were important, but oddly enough, it was almost more process and procedural that folks learned about. One of the big takeaways from the vegetation management study was the extent to which local laws inhibited the utilities' ability to maintain their infrastructure and protect their infrastructure. And in some cases, all it took was for there to be local awareness that, look, you have this law in place, it's preventing us from maintaining vegetation in a particular area, and it leads to more outages. And once localities were aware of that, they actually made, some of them actually made adjustments to the laws so that the utility, so it was just awareness was the biggest barrier to vegetation management. And then of course, probably what's been our most extensive work was the undergrounding model, where basically a tool that allows us to measure the effect of changing the infrastructure in some way, whether it's undergrounding, whether it's swapping out wood poles for composite poles, whatever the measure happens to be, in a virtual environment, and study what happens when you subject the existing infrastructure and then this infrastructure that you're intending to change to, let's say, 10,000 hurricane seasons, and see what happens in that locality. And you can do that before you've actually spent any money, and that's important, because all this hurricane hardening, it all costs something. And in the end, it's the people who are paying for it. And so it's important for utilities, for regulators, to make sure that when people are being asked to spend money on something, they're receiving fair value for that investment.
All right, well, thank you. So to the audience, in about, well, as soon as I get through this next question, I'll be looking for questions from you in the chat. So please put those in there. I'll pass them on. I'll moderate for another 20 minutes to our speakers. Then after that 20 minutes is over, I'm going to turn things over to Samantha, and we'll have much more of an open mic approach, where she'll invite you to voice your thoughts, to engage directly with the speakers, with each other, or however that might be useful to you. But I have one more question, and this is one that actually came from a gentleman who's been a speaker for us several times in these Next Practices live sessions, and that's John Reed. And Garfield, John was specifically addressing this to you, but I'll let Ted chime in as well. He was wondering what you will be doing more of undergrounding, taking the aerial lines, putting them underground, given the probabilities of hurricanes. So what are your thoughts and plans in that regard?
Yeah, no, as John well knows, that is the way to harden our infrastructure the best, obviously. And it's an area of infrastructure that suffered greatly coming out of Hurricane Dorian. So that is absolutely going to be the approach in places like Abaco and even Grand Bahama. And we're continuing to harden the infrastructure in New Providence. And we have 700 islands in the Bahamas. About 25, 26 of them are inhabited. Infrastructure hardening is an expensive proposition. So it's something that we obviously have to do in sort of measured amounts. And what is going to help us get that done as economically as possible, as I mentioned earlier, is infrastructure sharing. So there's no need for both competitors, and we've got one other mobile competitor in the Bahamas, for instance. There's no need for both of us to be running separate ducts. We could run all of our infrastructure through one duct and share that infrastructure, share towers. So we're actually engaged in that process in Abaco as we speak. So we're sharing duct space now with our competitor in Abaco, and we're going to continue to do and engage in initiatives like that in order to make the infrastructure hardening that just has to happen in hurricane belts like ours, just from a risk management standpoint. So infrastructure sharing and burying cable is absolutely number one on our agenda for preparing for catastrophic weather events, for sure.
All right, well, thank you. So Ted, you've studied this, focused on the U.S., primarily Florida, and we get a mixed answer in Florida's situation. Describe kind of how this all is thought about and works from your studies.
Sure. One of the challenges that we face is that there's really no way to completely insulate our infrastructure from damage. When we're making choices on where to locate the infrastructure, you're basically trading off one type of threat for another. So certainly when you have above ground systems, they're a lot more susceptible to wind, to flying debris, falling trees, things like that. But as soon as you take that infrastructure and you put it underground, now it's more susceptible to water incursion from storm surge, from flooding. So, in Florida, we have, like here in Gainesville, as an example, Gainesville is pretty far inland, and the damage that the city of Gainesville is most concerned with is wind events, flying debris, falling trees. So a lot of our infrastructure is underground because, let's face it, if we have problems with storm surge in Gainesville, then the rest of the state is in a lot bigger trouble than we are. And we don't have a lot of flooding except around localized creeks and rivers. So water incursion is not as big a threat here in Gainesville. So underground makes a lot more sense for the infrastructure. We have coastal areas in Florida, though, where water incursion is a huge threat. And in places like that, some of them still underground for other reasons, aesthetic purposes and historical significance and the like. But when you're looking at it from a damage prevention perspective, if that's your main goal, then underground may not be the best place in those areas. So the challenge that we face is there really isn't a blanket answer to this. You can't look at it and say, above ground is always better or underground is always better, because you're trading off one type of threat for another. And so the most important thing is assessing, what's the threat that we're most concerned with, and then taking the measures that you need to insulate from that threat, with the understanding that now you're going to increase the risk from the other one. But in some cases, as I said, like here in Gainesville, that it's not as big a threat. And in lots of other areas, they're not as concerned with the water incursion. So it's just that trade-off, and there is no blanket answer to the question. That's what makes it so challenging.
Okay. So Garfield, you implied that when you were talking about, where it makes sense, when it makes sense. Did you want to elaborate at all?
No, Dr. Kury makes a great point. So, there is no sort of perfect solution, right? You really just got to assess what your primary risk is and act accordingly. Look, aerial transmission has served you great till you get sort of a hurricane with 220-mile wind gusts, right? Then all of a sudden it's not so great anymore.
Yeah.
So you really just, Dr. Kury's dead right. You've got to make your assessments, be clear about what the major risk factor is, and then sort of implement your strategy accordingly. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Nothing's very easy in any of this work.
No.
All right. So we have a question from Franz, and this is to you, Garfield. He would like for you to elaborate on this issue of resilience and infrastructure sharing. So he's questioning, if the infrastructure isn't already hardened, does sharing really make the network more resilient? Could you kind of explain a little bit more of that connection between sharing and resilience?
Well, sure. So again, I think we established, and Dr. Kury's dead right. Resilience and hardening is definitely based on sort of where the primary risks come from. If you're going to bury your infrastructure, then it just makes more economic sense to infrastructure share rather than have sort of multiple ducts running up and down your streets, right? So infrastructure sharing is more of an economic, I think, decision variable than it is a sort of resilience issue, right? Because depending on the risk, burying might be the right way to go, as well as from an aerial standpoint. Mobility towers need to be hardened better than we'd hardened them in the past. They were hardened to withstand 150-mile-an-hour winds. They've got to withstand wind speeds now, we realize, of way more than that. Again, there, it doesn't make sense putting up multiple towers, right? It makes sense to share those towers once they've been hardened, just from an economic standpoint, in order to get the kind of resilience you're going to need to withstand some of these superstorms that we're getting now through the region. So one's an economic decision, as Dr. Kury clearly pointed out. From a resilience standpoint, you got to identify the primary risk and invest accordingly.
All right, so if I could follow up on that, Garfield. So as people are looking towards going to 5G, fifth generation telecommunications technologies, that's going to change the cell structure, is my understanding. Could you elaborate on that and how that affects how you think about sharing, how you think about hardening?
Well, yeah, so 5G is clearly going to change the game. The challenge in our region, though, I think, is that we are a bit way off from actually implementing 5G so far. 5G is still bleeding edge in the Caribbean. We're still trying to get data mobility adoption up the levels that even begin to approach first world levels. So LTE access right now is pretty much the state of the art in our region and will probably be that way for the foreseeable future. Handsets, for instance, handset technology and the price of 5G based handsets are still not at that level where the broad, cross section of the public are going to be able to afford those handsets. So that's not the challenge that we're sort of, worried about right now, frankly. But it's going to present some unique challenges once we actually begin to, adopt 5G. We've actually planned to test 5G in a couple of our markets. A year or two ago, we planned to sort of establish a test case in Antigua that didn't work out. So we're dabbling with introducing 5G to the region right now, but we're still a ways off yet.
Okay, very good. So we have a question also from David Cox, who both of you know quite well, I think, and Garfield, it's targeted towards you, it's pointed towards you, but Ted will have some to chime in on this as well. So the question that David asks is this: how does operating a business in a place like the Bahamas, which is prone to hurricanes, affect the costs of operating? And what are some of the financial planning considerations? And what's your experience with the regulator during a hurricane? Well, let's cut off there. Let's start with the finances. How does it affect your costs? How does it affect your financial planning?
Yeah, well, so the costs of running a modern telecoms network in an archipelago like the Bahamas, where you've got multiple islands across, hundreds, even, hundreds and hundreds of miles of ocean, is tough. And tough to make a solid economic case out of in the best of times. Mm-hmm. That's just a fact. These are subscale markets. We got 300,000 people in the Bahamas total, and they're spread out, like I said, across all of these islands. So some of these islands where we are bound to provide service by universal service agreements with our government are subscale, and the economics of it don't sort of make traditional for a traditional sound business case. So the economics are always tough, and it's made doubly and triply so during a catastrophic weather event. So risk management's key. You've got to insure properly. You've got to make sure that you're executing on the right sort of risk management and applying the right metrics to getting reasonable paybacks in the event of catastrophic weather events. During sort of business as usual, as you sort of prepare, you've got to maintain these networks relentlessly. You really got to make sure that you sort of spend the time and resources required to engage in all of the hygiene activities that you need to put in order to keep these networks humming the way you will need to. That will make them more resilient and enable them to recover when you go through one of these events. So to answer David's question, it's never easy. It's never an economic sort of, it's always an economic challenge, even in the best of times, but risk management's key. You've got to engage in the hygiene activity required to maintain these networks, and you just got to be vigilant.
Okay. So Ted, you've studied this on the electric infrastructure. Tell us about costs and financial planning in that context.
Yeah, I think the key to remember in this context is while the decisions are important, I think what's key here is the framework, and let me explain that. Regulators are faced with this decision of, should we allow this cost to be recovered from customers? And a lot of regulators use the standard of, was this a prudent investment? Is this a reasonable decision given the information available at the time? And this is why the framework is important, because it's really tempting to assess prudency after the fact. And that's not really fair when it comes to preparing for storms, because you're in a situation where, especially for preparation, you're caught in a kind of a no man's land where, let's say you commit a lot of resources to prepare for an incoming storm, and then the storm veers off at the last minute, and somebody inevitably shows up in the papers, well, why did you spend all this money on preparing when the storm didn't even hit? On the other hand, if you took the tactic that, well, we're not sure if the storm is going to get here, so we're not going to expend a lot of resources to prepare, then the storm hits, and then the question comes up, well, why weren't you better prepared? I mean, you're in a situation where it's almost, damned if you do, damned if you don't. So, but the framework, though, having a framework in place with the understanding that, in this particular case, these are the steps that we're going to take. If this is the case, these are the steps we're going to take. So, maybe you have a set of decisions that you're making, a week out, and then 72 hours out, and then 48 hours out, 36 hours out, and so on and so forth. And, preparation steps. I think that makes life easier, not only on the regulator, but I also think it makes it easier on the operator. But it takes work to put that framework in place. And I know that, for years when Florida was not being hit by storms, I mentioned before about these annual workshops that we were having talking about storm preparedness. There were a lot of folks, when we were going 5, 6, 7, 8 years without a hurricane, was, we really have to keep doing this. I mean, why do we have to keep talking about this? I mean, it's not like we're getting any storms. But when we did get one, and in fact, when we got two, all of that basically paid off, because you had gone through all those steps. You had continued to talk about the process, even when it was difficult. And that's really the key, is establishing the framework, establishing that dialogue, and then maintaining it, even when people are saying maybe you don't need to do that.
All right, very good. So both of you have talked a lot about risk management, and I'll just illustrate, kind of what that looked like in some of the work that we've done. Early on, we were developing the computer model that Ted wrote on how do we predict the hardening, of the infrastructure's ability to withstand storms. I thought we would be kind of optimizing on average. That sometimes they go out, sometimes the grid withstands, and you just get it right on average because the economics would tell you to do that. One of the regulatory staff people, Bob Trapp, just said absolutely not. He said, Tampa withstands a Cat 3 hurricane. I don't care how frequently it comes. We will always withstand a Cat 3 hurricane. And it was just a risk management decision. No right or wrong answer to it. It's just how did you assess the risks? And that's why people get paid to make those hard decisions. So this finishing up David's question, then I'm going to turn things over to Sam to moderate the open mic discussion, if you will. So this is back to you then, Garfield. David is wondering what your experiences in working with the regulator, planning for 2020, thinking about how you prepare yourselves.
You know, the regulator in the Bahamas is actually quite good at coordinating with essential service providers like ours in both preparing for and getting through these catastrophic weather events. Normally, for instance, the various propositions that you want to offer in the market, whether they be mobile or fixed propositions, you usually have to go through the regulator first and get, go through a fairly exhaustive approval process. That obviously is eliminated during catastrophic weather events. So you're free to sort of offer the kinds of propositions you need to a public that has been devastated by a hurricane, for instance. So they work with you pretty closely on that and allow you to engage in what you think you need to do in order to get your customers back to a sense of normality. They're also a great conduit to the various government agencies as well that are required to sort of be part of the restoration process. So our regulator is normally a very active regulator, I will say, as charitably as I can, and in the middle of sort of the kind of catastrophic events that hurricanes present, they are actually quite helpful.
All right, very good. Ted, you've talked about coordination between the electric utilities and regulator. Anything you'd like to add?
I think the main thing is that when you look back at that process that started this whole thing in Florida, those series of workshops pulling people together, I really think that it was only the regulator that could have pulled that off. I don't think the state legislature necessarily had the power or had the statutory might to pull that diverse group of stakeholders together. I think this was the case, and when we're specifically looking at utility matters, when we're looking at these coordination efforts, I really think that it's important that the leadership come from the regulator, because I certainly here in Florida and in a lot of other countries I've worked with, it's really only the regulator that has the ability to pull all those folks together. Now, the combination of the backing of the statutes, the technical knowledge, the knowledge of the economics, and having and being able to assimilate the voices of the customer, the voices of the utilities, and all of the other stakeholders. So, this cooperative effort, can provide a lot of benefits, but I really think it takes the regulator to get it going.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, both of you. So, Sam, we have a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to turn things over to you to moderate, give people an open mic so they can talk directly with everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Jamison. So just so everybody knows how to do that, so if you're using a laptop or a desktop, you'd want to go to the bottom of your screen, the toolbar. You'd click on the participant tab, and there's a hand raising icon that you would click. Once you click that, that will prompt me that you'd like to ask any additional questions or share, and then I will unmute your audio, and then you're free to unmute your video if you'd like. If you're using a tablet or a cell phone, that toolbar and participant tab will be at the top of your screen, and you'll follow the same steps. I sent everyone a note in the group chat, so you can reference that if needed. I don't see any hands raised just yet, but I know Sydney was the last person who submitted a question, so I can go ahead and go to Sydney and unmute you, Sydney, if you'd like to share. Hi, Sydney, can you hear us?
Yes, morning, Samantha, morning, Dr. Jameson, Dr. Kury, and Mr. Sinclair. Great presentation, pretty much right up my alley. As it relates, as a regulator in St. Martin, hurricanes are a yearly event, or I must say that, or at least we prepare yearly for it, because it's not a matter of if, but more like when. And we have been through 2 major hurricanes in the last 20 years. And you know, we've learned a lot from this. And I totally agree with Mr. Sinclair's statements as it relates to burying infrastructure under the ground. We have done that after our major hurricane in '95, Hurricane Lewis, which devastated the island and a couple of other islands in the Caribbean chain as well. And at that time, that was the strongest hurricane to date. And 22 years and 1 day later, we were hit with Irma, and which is also now recorded as the strongest hurricane to date in the Caribbean region, or in the Atlantic hurricane season period at least. And thank God for, well, in this case, I would say thank God for our experiences in '95. We buried about 80 to 90%, and we have not finished this yet. We're still doing some more burying with that. And we were able to, after Irma, we were able to get back up and running within a matter of days. Not weeks, not months, days. Electricity was back to major facilities within a couple of hours after the hurricane has passed. Fixed landline services was never interrupted. Of course, if your facility was damaged, of course you cannot access that service, but they were up and running. The major problem that we had this time around was because of the super strong winds. Where the tower facilities, those were heavily damaged, and but we were, well, coincidentally, we were in the process of eliminating, or not eliminating per se, but speaking to the operators in terms of coming off the hills with these huge towers and go to more microsites. And thankfully, that happened over a period of time, whereby the sites that were on top of the hills were just sites that had to bridge parts of the island that was not accessible by either fixed services or microsites. So it was like remote sites of the island that was covered by these high towers on the hilltops. And of course, broadcasts also were affected, because those have to use high altitude and high towers to be able to provide their services. So that's still an ongoing issue that we're surviving with. But again, it's a timely, really timely topic matter, and I applaud PERC for this. I have one question the last question I had was for Mr. Sinclair, is that had the Bahamas or your company in particular made arrangements or have arrangements for alternative communications resources and infrastructure aid after a hurricane or a natural disaster, in terms of, do you have agreements with the US, in particular Florida or Jamaica or any other Caribbean island or country for that respect? And if you need towers, you need equipment that can be loaned or accessed very easily. And as it relates to alternative communications, are there any provisions made for, let's say, VSATs and the like, whereby it can be deployed right after an event if there are areas not being covered or has no ability to have communications, and the government, as a matter of fact, as well?
Yeah, no, Sydney, thanks for that question. We did make, after Dorian, arrangements to have VSAT coverage, which we didn't need to deploy, frankly, because we benefited from the fact that between our network, our mobile network, and the competitors' mobile network, we were able to come back up through national roaming agreements between us, get back up pretty quickly after the huge hurricane experience we had, particularly in Abaco, which was absolutely devastated, especially areas to the central parts of Abaco and north of it, less so in the south. So we'd had VSAT arrangements in place as a backup, absolutely, but we didn't need to because we hammered out national roaming agreements, and between our networks and the competitors' varying degrees of resilience, we were able to get back up and running so customers had a network on which they could through which they could communicate with loved ones and family and friends, obviously. With respect to interacting with other governments and countries, we have a headquarters, CWC does, in Miami in South Florida. So we had a logistics hub set up there that was able and was capable of sort of managing all of our logistics issues in getting supplies in and out of those hugely affected islands. So we rely on South Florida quite a bit for our restoration and recovery activities for sure.
Okay, cool. Nice to know. And you mentioned something that really warmed my heart, if I must say that the regards to the national roaming. Because I'm the regulator for Mr. Martin and the head of the technical department as such, and that was one of the things I proposed as a lesson learned after Irma, and wrote a paper on it and submitted it to the authorities and also to the operators for consultation. I was nearly lynched for that because it's like, how dare you propose national roaming and in terms of resources and and in times of crisis where you open up all networks to everybody, and I tried my best to explain it, but I'm so glad that Bahamas had that experience. And if Mr. Dr. Jameson, if you allow some extra time, can you please explain that? How was your experience with that? Because I'm very curious about it. Because I'm telling you, I was literally thrown out of office for it to even pursue such an adventure.
Simply. And if there's any documentation we can forward to people, please let us know.
No, sure. We
to
be fair, Sydney, I can see why you were thrown out. Correctly, because look, national roaming is kind of like medicine, right? You need it, but it don't taste good, right? So you really don't want to have your customers roaming on the network of your competitor. Again, like insurance, I'm making all these analogies, kind of something you don't really want to pay for or have to deal with till you absolutely need it, right? So no, we hammered a deal out because the fact of the matter is there were areas where our infrastructure was completely incapacitated and our competitors' network was standing up, and there were
totally, and that was my premise exactly. And
there were other areas where our infrastructure stood up and our competitor could have used some help as well. So it worked out quite well. I think both, like I said, took it like a dose of necessary medicine. Frankly, we eliminated the agreement the absolute split second that we could. And as soon as we got our infrastructure back up. But no, I think it's an absolutely integral tool and an example of the ways, to the regulator point, an example of the ways competitors can and have to cooperate in order to make sure customers and communities remain served by these absolutely critical and essential services. But not something I will tell you an operator sort of looks forward to, is sort of allowing your customers to roam on somebody else's network. Not fun.
I can imagine. Like I said, I had that experience. Now, one more question relates to that.
Another question.
Yeah. So, is the agreement, who garnered that agreement? Was it the operators or the regulator?
No,
and then that would be it.
We have that agreement out between us.
Okay, good, perfect.
Go ahead, Garfield, then we'll move on.
No. I was just saying we hammered that agreement out between us. We got together, said this is a catastrophic event. We've got to do this so everybody can sort of make contact and use these essential services. Took us no time at all, but like I said, we kind of held our noses.
Okay. All right. Very good. Sam, who's next?
Yeah, so I do have a question that a participant sent me via chat. Unfortunately, they're not able to share audio or video right now, so I'm going to go ahead and ask that. It's directed to both Dr. Kury and Mr. Sinclair. And so the question is, what are their views on regulated infrastructure sharing?
So I can jump in there because I'm sure Dr. Kury is going to have a way more sort of practical and studious sort of approach to it. Look, from where I sit, infrastructure sharing or any sort of requirement for competitors to leverage one another's assets needs to be arrived at through arm's length negotiations. Prescribe having an outside entity, whether it be a regulator or other government entity, prescribe the parameters for agreements between commercially focused competing entities, I think is just bad for business. It's going to be bad for the customer. And it's going to be bad for communities. I think the customer always wins when arm's length negotiations between well-run competitors arrive at an agreement to share infrastructure that will provide critical services to customers. When it's sort of prescribed from outside, all of the variables that have to be considered by private interests who indeed have to, at the end of the day, allocate the capital required to build these networks and deploy these assets. They always have all of the variables, or should have all of the variables that need to be considered at the forefront of their minds. They negotiate, come together. It's always the best deal. Like the national roaming agreement I just discussed. Look, a regulator could have prescribed that and sort of prescribed pricing and prescribed how we did it. It would have taken forever. And would probably not have resulted in the best deal for consumers. We got together, hammered that out quickly, and I think consumers benefited.
I think from a regulator standpoint, what you're mostly concerned with is how are you allocating the costs? How are we allocating the responsibilities? Our friend Michael Pollitt always likes to say, you don't want to, you never want to price the fire brigade when your house is on fire. So having that framework in place before you need it, under these circumstances, this is the way we're going to allocate costs. And certainly if there's one thing we can learn about various cost allocation methods is that it's really hard to come up with one that everybody thinks, yeah, this is a great this is a great allocation method. Everyone's always going to be looking at it and saying, maybe this is not fair to me because of this reason or that reason. So you're never going to get a cost allocation methodology that everybody likes. But if you can get to one where everybody understands it, everybody uses it to make decisions going forward, it's a transparent methodology. That's, from a regulator standpoint, that's one of the things you're going to be concerned with, is this idea of how are we deciding who pays for what and under what circumstances. And as I said, having the framework in place to guide that decision-making process, it's one of those things that you can't just put it together on the fly. That it helps a lot if that is established beforehand, and then that forms the basis for your decisions going forward.
Okay. Sam, I have a question somebody sent to me privately. I'd just like to ask it. It says, with most insurance payouts only allowing to build as was and not to build better to include better resiliency, how do the telecom companies plan to achieve resilience that can better withstand these natural or man-made disasters? So Garfield, we'll start with you. Then Ted, you've had some experience with the insurance issues as well. Garfield, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. So that's exactly right. That is the conundrum of sort of recovering from these catastrophic events, is that you never get enough insurance funds or a payout to really put you back to where you need to be in order to future-proof a network. And that's where you always have to be. So look, it's and I can just tell you sort of what the experience is in a sort of conglomerate of operators within a sort of giant global business. You literally have to compete for capital, right? Capital allocation is where the rubber meets the road in sort of, conglomerate telecoms businesses like ours. And so what we have to do is create fairly detailed future scenarios of what a recovered Abaco in the instance of Dorian, for instance, and a recovered Grand Bahama is going to look like in order to warrant the investment we're going to need to future-proof the network, right? So we've got to remember we're talking, private interests here with discerning shareholders who require a reasonable rate of return. And so everything you do, catastrophic event or otherwise, has to be done sort of through the prism of, is this going to make economic sense over the long run? And so the job we have as operators on the ground in a place like Bahamas is to be able to, as quickly as possible and as accurately as possible, project what a future state is going to look like. Because the fact of the matter is no sense future-proofing a network expensively if nobody's moving back to Abaco, for instance, right? Thousands of people have had to leave, obviously. If they're not coming back, no sense future-proofing that network. So it really is about sort of as accurately as possible projecting what that future is going to look like, and then making the case for the resources required to future-proof that network. It's not a perfect science by any means, but it's what you've got to do.
Okay, Ted.
Well, in Florida, we haven't had to worry so much about the specifics of insurance from a third party, because after the storm season of 2004, 2005, no insurance company will insure Florida's infrastructure, or utility infrastructure anyway. So Florida moved to a program of self-insurance where everybody pays a little bit extra on their bill. It basically goes into a fund that is administered by the regulator, and then when utilities suffer damage, they are allowed to petition the regulator to receive recovery from that fund. But last year, the Florida State Legislature did something interesting where they established that storm hardening will now be basically broken out of what we call base rates and receive its own charge. So now, under this newer framework, the idea behind it is that utilities will actually come to the Florida Public Service Commission on a project-by-project basis and say, look, this is what we want to spend money on. This is the impact it's going to have on the network. Look, we're demonstrating that the benefits to consumers are greater than the costs. And the regulator will then go through and say, yes, that is a worthy project for the customer's money, and presumably that's a project that maybe we don't want to get into right now. And so they'll be looking at this on a project-by-project basis. A little bit more transparent. I think it's also going to be a much bigger workload for the regulator. We're still early in the implementation of this. It's going to be interesting to see how this works out.
All right. Sam, do you have any other questions? People's hands up.
Don't have any raised hands or additional questions submitted now.
All right. So I have one more question. We just have a couple of minutes left. Ted, you just talked about how the electric utilities think about cost recovery. They go to the regulator to talk about it, and they can change their prices. But Garfield, you're in a different situation. You don't have a regulator saying, hey, raise your prices because you've got additional costs. You've got a competitive market. So how does it work? How does cost recovery work for you?
But like I said, very, very carefully, right? It is not a perfect science, like you said, especially in subscale markets like not just the Bahamas but the Caribbean in general, right? These are subscale markets. The networks are you don't get a break on networks costs, right? Your network operators aren't saying, oh, you've got a small market, so here's what towers are going to cost. Here's what infrastructure is going to cost. So you have to pay the same amount in these subscale markets. So you've got to, it puts a premium on sort of your operating model, right? You've got to operate at maximum efficiency. So stuff like OPEX to revenue ratios are monitored acutely because they just can't get to certain levels, especially in our subscale markets. The cost of acquiring customers has got to come down. You just really have to be a super efficient operator. So I get up every day, outside of having to plan for these catastrophic weather events, you get up every day figuring out, how do I squeeze an extra penny, dollar, a couple of dollars out of my operating model and the cost of operating, because you just don't get any break on the fixed cost of erecting and administering and maintaining these networks at all. And they're just getting more and more expensive, not less. So the focus in our business is on as efficient an operating model as you can possibly deliver. And that's sort of what the performance management is really all about is, are you operating as efficiently as you can or not? Because that's the only place you have to sort of play around with.
All right, so thank you both very much, Ted and Garfield. You provided a lot of really good information, and it's very beneficial to our friends around the world as they try to deal with their own situations. And thank you to all the participants for being here. Your questions, your inputs were really important here as well.